Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting in 2014 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I please remind everybody present to turn off mobile phones and any other electronic devices. Our first item of business this morning is to decide whether to take items 3, 4, 5 and 6 in private. Are members agreed? Yes. Members have indicated their agreement. Our next item of business is to continue our Stage 1 consideration of the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill, as part of which we will also consider the most recent update on the implementation of the Scotland Act. I therefore welcome to the meeting Eleanor Emberson of the Scottish Government, John Kenny of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and John King of the Registrars of Scotland. And I understand there's no statement from the panel, so therefore we will go straight to questions. And I'm sure you all know how things are on the committee. I'll start off with some questions and we'll open out to colleagues around the table. I'm just wondering if you can, first of all, talk us through the where we are in terms of the cost estimates for administration of the devolved taxes. We understand that initially the estimate was about 25% lower than the cost from HMRC, making a saving of some £5 million or so. However, since then there have been estimates for new activity of about £3.51 million. I understand that the joint 6-monthly progress update of 4th of October stated that Revenue Scotland was in the process of, and I quote, defining the resources that were required to be in place and trained in time for the collection of taxes to start in April 2010. We expect this review to be available by December. However, the most recent update states that we are currently finalising the expected staffing structure. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through the costs and where we are in terms of that staffing structure.
Certainly. So in terms of costs, I think the important thing is which figures we're comparing. The original HMRC estimate was their estimate for collecting two taxes for Scotland that were exact equivalents of the UK stamp duty land tax and the UK landfill tax. And that's all HMRC could have estimated at the time that they did it, because this was before we had proposals for how the devolved taxes might operate, how they might be different. So some of the cost changes are estimates for things that would never have been included in HMRC's estimate because they're nothing to do with what HMRC were estimating for. And there is an estimate for IT expenditure of £1.5 million, which is, we made clear in the previous financial memorandum that we hadn't originally made any provision for a central IT system for Revenue Scotland. And we don't absolutely strictly need that. We could proceed as we had envisaged under the original financial memoranda, where there would be IT at Registers of Scotland and IT at SEPA, and Revenue Scotland would simply rely on those, because that's all you absolutely need for the collection. But we have all worked together on the design of this and come to the view that it is going to be more efficient and more effective if Revenue Scotland had an additional investment in IT, with the expectation that that would allow us to give a better service, but would particularly allow us to do better on compliance and analysis of data. We would hold all the data and be able to analyse it in whatever way we wished, and that would, in fact, probably pay for itself over time, because we would expect to recover higher tax. So there are really two issues in here. There's one that's an additional investment, and there's some other elements in the remaining £2 million that are not to do with what HMRC were estimating for. So our view is that the 16.7 million figure, which we quoted as the basic cost of set up an operation, stands. We could do it for 16.7 million. Our argument is that it would be a worthwhile investment to put some more money in to improve our compliance effort, both at Revenue Scotland and also, as you'll have seen from the figures, at SEPA, and that should more than pay for itself in the extra tax receipts we would get. And there's one other element in there about the costs of the tax tribunal, which are something HMRC wouldn't have been quoting for anyway, because HMRC doesn't pay for the costs of tax tribunals, so that was never part of the HMRC estimate either.
Yeah, I mean, I realise that even with these additional new activities, you're about just over £2 million, lower costs, and you'd have more robust collection, etc., etc. But I'm still, the second part of my question, I wonder if you can answer that also.
Of course. So in terms of staffing structures, we've got a much more robust view of how that should be, and that's reflected in the revised figures that we've given you. You'll have noticed that not only have the figures changed for Revenue Scotland and indeed for SEPA, and I'll let John speak about that in a moment, but that we've structured the costs differently because we've taken a different view about exactly how the teams would be structured and what we would need. I was merely trying to indicate in the letter that there's still, as you might expect, we're still, with a year to go, not absolutely and completely final on staffing structures, and there's still a bit more to go. But I wouldn't anticipate it changing the costs to any, in any sort of significant way.
Okay. Now, in terms of the IT, £1 million set-up costs and £100,000 a year running costs sounds a bit ballpark to me. You know, if you'd had here in these figures, it would be £922,000 and £87,000 for running costs, whatever it would be. I would take the view that you've actually drilled down into the figures and looked at exactly what you need. £1 million with £100,000 running costs almost feels like a guesstimate to me. I mean, how close are you to giving us more accurate figures in terms of the IT? Because that figure has been there for a number of months, actually, relatively unchanged, and I would have thought as time had progressed you'd have been able to refine them a wee bit more.
That figure's been there since December. We took expert advice from IT colleagues in Scottish Government in putting the figure together. You're right that it is, of course, an estimate, and until we've actually concluded a contract for the delivery of the system, I won't be able to give you the absolutely precise figure. I would expect to have concluded the contract within a few weeks, and we can update the committee in the usual way later on with what the precise figures are.
I'd appreciate that. Now, you talked about the need to take a stronger approach to combating tax avoidance, and as you said in your paper, the committee is certainly supportive of that. And you go on to talk about the tax gap, and you say that in terms of LBTT, you plan to make a modest additional investment of £230,000, which you would hope would cut the tax gap from a potential £9 million to about £4.5 million. So you're effectively bringing in about a minimum of £4.5 million. Would that be right?
No, I'm afraid that's not. If we haven't explained it properly, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid that's not the intention. We were trying to estimate what the tax gap might be for land and buildings transaction tax. And what we did was we looked at the tax gap, the estimate of the tax gap for a Scottish share of the tax gap for stamp duty land tax, and we think that that is of the order of £9 million. Excuse me. And it's difficult to estimate what the tax gap might be for a brand new tax because, as the committee knows, you passed the land and buildings transaction tax legislation.
So you hope the avoidance will be less.
Exactly. You've designed out an amount of the avoidance. So we took a 50% as a very round estimate of how much might have been designed out and said that we think cautiously there might be £4.5 million of a tax gap left. And we're saying we would spend £230,000 to try and make some inroads into that £4.5 million. Right.
Okay. So you're basically saying you make yes. It says you make a conservative estimate that it could be around £4.5 million a year, £22.5 million, and we now plan to reduce the expected tax. Okay. So you're right. It's not about clearing the entire £4.5 million, but you're hoping to make significant progress towards that. Although obviously I can understand you can't estimate exactly what the size of that is and how far you would go. But when I was looking at the financial memorandum, I was looking at in terms of the landfill tax, you're talking about investing a reasonably similar amount, about £210,000, in terms of reducing the potential SLFT liability, which, if it was charged, will be over some £20 million. But maybe I've missed it, but I'm not really. I don't really see where the figures are about what additional revenue you hope to be able to bring in terms of reducing that.
Two potential streams. There's the increase from those already within the system that might be misclassifying waste and paying the lower rate instead of the higher rate. But I think the more significant amount is in relation to illegal waste sites. So illegal waste sites are currently out with the UK landfill tax regime. If you don't have a licence, you don't pay the tax. So that 210,000 is specifically geared to tackling illegal waste sites. So that's a whole stream that don't currently pay tax at all at the moment. That the new legislation has given us what we think the very powerful tool to bring those into compliance and taxation.
Yes, I'm aware of that, but how much do you expect to bring in from that?
It's very, very difficult to say because we're dealing with sites just now that would have individual sites that could potentially have a 7-figure liability on one site. To give you an idea of the potential scale, it's very difficult to quantify because again, it's not been quantified because it's never been liable for it before. But it's multi-million pound, we believe.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to open up the session to colleagues around the table now, and the first person to ask questions will be Jamie, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you. Convener, I've just a few questions arising from the evidence we've taken thus far from outside bodies. One of the issues that's been raised is the additional level of privilege afforded to the legal profession as opposed to other professionals, with some concern raised by ICAS and the Chartered Institute of Taxation, less so, as said, from the Law Society and the Faculty of Advocates. I'm just wondering what your perspective on this matter might be.
My my understanding is that there would be a difficulty over bringing tax advisors into the terms of the privilege to confidential communications because of the legal definition of tax advisor. That there is my understanding is that there is a legal definition already in UK law which would allow people who aren't members of professional bodies somehow to be swept up as tax advisors, and we wouldn't want to get into the position where your friend who had happened to talk to you about tax could somehow claim privilege as a tax advisor. I'm not the expert on this, though, so you might want to probe that legal point elsewhere, but my understanding is there is a legal difficulty with it.
Okay, I mean that kind of does reflect some of the evidence we've been provided with, some as well. So another issue that was raised was the Charter for Revenue Scotland. There's a concern about the difference between Revenue Scotland aspiring to meet the terms of this charter as opposed to taxpayers having to meet it. I think, to be fair, the Bill team have reflected on this and they're looking at it, but just to be clear, you do accept there should be equivalence, and we can give an assurance that Revenue Scotland will look to meet the terms of the charter and not just aspire to them.
I completely accept that, and it should be equivalent, yes.
Okay. Another issue that's been raised with us was Revenue Scotland's ability to contract delegates to exercise some of its functions, people who aren't directly employed by Revenue Scotland. And one issue of concern that was raised was, how do we ensure that they don't exceed their remit? Should they have to adhere to the charter? And another issue that occurs to me, I think it's something we explored earlier on, and this has been an issue with HMRC. People have been brought in to work for HMRC, and then they've actually used the expertise they've gathered to help other people go off and devise avoidance schemes. I'm just wondering if you can tell us if these matters have been considered.
As far as the delegation goes, we have given undertakings to the committee that obviously before we're in live operation you will see what schemes of delegation we intend to have with Registers of Scotland and SEPA. Regardless of the detail of the scheme of delegation, Revenue Scotland will remain ultimately liable. So if anyone were to exceed their authority, it's still Revenue Scotland whom you would ultimately hold to account. And so I think we can manage that through the arrangements that we'll have with Registers of Scotland and SEPA. So I'm comfortable with the way the legislation is drafted. I think it allows us the room to set down a formal scheme of delegation out with the legislation, which the committee can, and indeed we can share publicly so people know what the terms of it are. The point about people leaving and then being able to provide advice to taxpayers on avoidance, I know people train with HMRC and then sometimes they leave and become private sector tax advisors. I don't think the situation would be fundamentally any different, I wouldn't envisage that colleagues from ROS or SEPA would, or indeed Revenue Scotland, would be rushing off to give people, to leave and give people advice on avoidance, but people do sometimes leave public bodies.
I said, from what you're saying, then these are issues that have been worked through just now, and this will come back to us, and we can see this as a committee. We can get the assurance that this has been looked at and
Surely, yes.
something's been laid out. Okay. And one final thing, an issue's been raised about the structure of Revenue Scotland, with executives not being on the board. Some have suggested they should be. Others have not particularly taken a view. Do you have a view on this?
I think you can make it work either way. I mean, I was previously the chief executive of a non-ministerial department, and I was a member of the board of that organisation. But equally, I've seen it work very well in models where the board holds the chief executive to account. I think what's important is that we understand what the structure is and what that means, so that you know whom you would want to invite if you needed to hold Revenue Scotland to account.
So you don't think it's that big an issue?
Personally, no. I think it could be worked either way.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, followed by John. Thank you for submitting the joint update note, which I thought was quite helpful. So I want to just go through some of the parts of that. Under the heading Policy Development and Secondary Legislation, you say that the current timetables for the RSTP bill and the secondary legislation should see everything in place in time by 1st April 2015. In terms of the use of the word should, why have you used should as opposed to will?
I think it was to relate to the current timetables. I mean, I was simply recognising that the committee, as much as anyone else, will dictate the timetable for the secondary legislation. So I was probably just being a little cautious.
Fine. So there's not. Maybe I'm reading too much into them, but there was nothing in there that you know that suggests that it might not happen by the fact. Okay.
I'm comfortable with the timetable
Sure.
as it stands.
Okay. Thank you. Secondly, then, under the heading Tax Administration Programme, there was a gateway review which ended in February, I think, of this year, and you've stated the overall assessment of delivery confidence was amber. Can you expand on what that means and why it was? Presumably, was it a possibility of red, amber, green? Or what were the possibilities, and why was it described as amber?
It's a 5-point scale. It's red, red, amber, amber, green, green. The description that goes with amber is significant issues exist requiring management attention. These appear resolvable at this stage and, if addressed promptly, should not present a cost/schedule overrun. So I have then gone on to outline what we're doing as a response to the Gateway Review recommendations.
What was the previous Gateway Review grading?
It was also amber.
Amber. So that's you. I guess 3 in a 5-point scale. You're in the middle of a 5-point scale. How do we get it to green? Because presumably it needs to be green when we hit the when we actually go live, or does it not really matter?
It will be green when we go live. I've run a number of large change projects and programmes before. I can't think of any that were green at this point, given the complexity of what we're trying to do. It would be very unusual for a gateway review of a complex change programme to have a green assessment. The gateway reviewers would be saying that there's absolutely nothing. Everything is perfect, and that would be very unusual at this point. And all the previous programmes were perfectly successful. I think the critical thing is that we attend to the recommendations that the team have made, which we're doing.
Okay, so the fact it's amber just now is in your view normal, or not, or certainly not a worry particularly?
It would be a worry if I were ignoring the recommendations,
Okay.
but I assure you we're not.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. In relation to, if we go on to the third page of your review then, IT, under the heading IT implementation, We've got obviously the sort of larger set-up costs for Revenue Scotland, and you have identified or given us the reasons why it's larger than it was initially. Is there any prospect that that figure of 1230 for Revenue Scotland ends up being significantly larger than 1230?
I've no reason to suppose that it will. As I say, we took expert advice on what we can expect the development costs to be. The 1 million figure and the additional, the 230,000 figure is the project management cost, which is pretty firm. The 1 million development cost, we took advice, as I say, on that, and we won't know for absolutely sure until we have a contract signed, but I've no reason to suppose it will be higher.
Okay. Same question then for Registers of Scotland. The cost description is build cost of new LBTT system, set-up cost £75,000. Is there any prospect that figure is higher than that, or is that a concrete figure?
Certainly our expectation in light of the explanation in the submission about the slightly changed approach to IT implementation is that 75,000 figure. It will certainly be a maximum. We anticipate that it will perhaps come down. There may be some reallocation of what would be our costs to Revenue Scotland.
And same question to SEPA, information systems, set-up cost 350,000. I mean, is there any prospect it could be higher than that, or is that a maximum?
Similar answer to my colleague. It's expected to reduce. If anything, it would be a maximum.
Okay, thank you. And the last thing I want to look on is just the final page of the 6-monthly update is a more colourful page. It's a chart, I guess, with the main areas on which you're focusing against a timeline. Green means it is complete, so that's clear. Blue obviously means it's on track or is being worked upon. If I just take the top one, which is IT, by now, if I read the chart right, ICT system requirements should be pretty much complete. I mean, is that now green or about to go green? That
is now green. It wasn't green at the time I wrote the letter,
sure,
but it is now green.
Okay, all right. Moving down, okay. The third one, staffing roles and responsibilities. Is that now, the top one, agree roles and responsibilities with ROS and SEPA, is that now complete or just about complete?
We're close. We've got proposals which colleagues at ROS and SEPA are considering. We'll need to get them formally signed off amongst the organisations, but it's very close.
Going down one, process mapping. I'm not an expert in process mapping, but I mean, is that looks as if it should be pretty much complete?
Yes.
Is that?
Yes.
That is complete.
I haven't actually seen it, but my understanding is that it's very nearly done. Yes.
Okay. And the last one, last question then is transition arrangements. You've got a heading agreement with HMRC. It looks as if that should be pretty much complete. I just wonder if it is.
I don't think I have a formal note of agreement from HMRC yet, but all the work has been done, and I think we're very close again.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Gavin, John, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, okay, that's us. The extra costs, so we've got 16.7 million, which is what HMRC quoted for, the Convener referred to earlier, and then the 3.5 million additional costs for new activity. So if we had gone with HMRC, we'd still have had that extra 3.5 million. Is that the case?
I don't know what the costs would have been with HMRC by now, because you would have been asking HMRC for an estimate for collecting the two taxes as they are now legislated for. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's difficult to speculate with what HMRC would now have been charging. It's hard to imagine that the cost would have gone down of their estimate. I assume it would have gone up, but I don't know precisely by how much.
Yes, because I mean that's right. My assumption would be that if their estimate for the base work was higher than what Revenue Scotland could do, it is likely that their charges for any extra work would have been extra as well.
Yes, I mean, they wouldn't, for instance, have had the advantage that we have of being able to look to colleagues in SEPA to do the compliance work on landfill tax, well, not in the same arrangement that we're intending to have. We would still have been facing the tribunal costs. And I think it's really hard to speculate, but I can't see that it would have gone down.
That's fair enough. Now, the tribunals, I mean, just explain that to me if you could, because maybe I should know this, but I mean, at the moment, if somebody disagrees or has a dispute or appeals or whatever, presumably they go through a system.
Yes.
And therefore, why is there an extra cost for tribunals?
The extra cost is about setting up the tribunal in Scotland. It's not a Revenue Scotland cost, obviously.
No.
It's complicated by the fact that the tribunal system itself is going through some change at the moment, but to a different timetable to the one that we are having to run to for the taxes. So I'm sorry, I forget the precise deadline. I think it's probably 2016 for the change to the new Scottish tribunal system. But because we have to go sooner than that, there's some interim cost associated with setting up a Scottish tax tribunal ahead of other set-up arrangements that will be made for separating Scottish tribunals from the UK tribunals.
So at the moment, if somebody is going through the system, they go to the UK tribunals, and that cost is covered by the UK somewhere.
There's a budget for HM Courts and Tribunals Service, which is an England and Wales body. It's an England and Wales body as far as it relates to courts, but it's a UK body as it relates to tribunals. The tribunals themselves, Scottish tribunals, are being merged under the overall leadership of the Lord President of the Court Session, and therefore the administrative arrangements will also be separated out and managed.
I suppose I'm thinking that the UK system must be making some savings in there if they're not having to operate these tribunals in Scotland anymore. I just wonder if that fits into the picture somewhere.
I'm not really. Excuse me. I'm not
asking the
really.
wrong person on that.
Yeah, I'm not really party to exactly how the conversations have gone on. There are some tribunals that are already devolved in Scotland, but the tax tribunal obviously isn't one of them. Where this is the cost associated with setting up a tax tribunal in Scotland from the start, rather than running for a year with a UK arrangement and then having to change it.
Okay, I can maybe ask that somewhere else. That's fine, thanks. Then the other area I'm interested in, I think, particularly is the extra cost for SEPA. And if I'm understanding this correctly, there's kind of two bits to this. One is the work you're going to be taking over from the current system, but am I right in saying there's another bit which is you're actually going to do extra work? And I was just wondering if you could kind of clarify between the two. I think one is, am I right in saying one's table 10 and one's table 13 are the two parts of the cost?
Yeah. So the £320,000 is the general compliance that we talked about on the sites currently within the system. That's the kind of like for like with what HMRC would do at the moment. The other cost is in relation.
Sorry, could you just clarify, because I've got table 13 is 210,000. Is that?
Yeah, that's the extra cost. That's the cost for the illegal waste sites. So
that's the extra cost.
That's the new powers that are in the Scottish landfill tax bill.
Right, but table 10's got 230, and you're saying 320. Is that a different figure?
Sorry, the estimated running costs. I've got it now. The 320 and the 230 that you're referring to, is the total additional compliance cost with Revenue Scotland and SEPA.
Right.
And then there's the 210.
Okay.
Is it the 210 that you're?
Where's the 320? Sorry, is that in a different table?
The 320 is the SEPA's running costs.
It's the total on table 9.
That are total.
It's on table 9. Sorry, right. That's great.
Thank you.
Right, I see that now. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thanks. Right. Okay. So, right, we've got the 210 then the 230. Now the 230 appears in table 1, but the 210 doesn't appear in table 1. Is that correct?
The estimated for new activity is in table 1 the 1,050,000. That's the 5 times the two. That's the 210 over 5 years.
All right, I'm with you there. Okay, right. Right, okay, I'm with you. Right, that clarifies that. Thank you. So on the actual basics of it, I mean, you're already out there finding illegal sites. Why is there an extra cost coming in?
So the 210 is to cover. We're out there looking for sites at the moment with respect to environmental pollution and environmental offences. Under these new powers, what we will be able to do is to go out. We'll have to actually identify and assess the amount of waste that's been deposited to actually calculate the liability, because under the legislation, SEPA will have to do the assessment, because we wouldn't expect the illegal operators to do an assessment because they're out with the system. So there'll be significant new work involved in doing the actual assessment, identifying how much waste has been deposited, identifying what the tax liability is, liaising with Revenue Scotland, and potentially subsequently the...
So at the moment, if you found illegal waste, you wouldn't really be weighing it, or...
You would be finding out, did it cause pollution, has it caused an environmental offence, and
yes,
etc. You wouldn't be working out the tax liability as such.
Right, and then it would just have to be moved somewhere else at the moment.
If provided you can find the relevant person to do that and go through the...
I mean, if you can't find a relevant person, does it not still have to be moved to a legal site?
Ideally, yeah, but it can take a long time to go through that and to identify it. You might be better excavating and making it safe inside, or other barriers in place, rather than actually moving it to...
And is that SEPA pays for that at the moment?
SEPA doesn't. SEPA will use means to try and identify the responsible person to undertake that work.
Right, and then they would have to transfer it to a legal site.
That's correct.
And it would be measured and paid for at that stage.
And the landfill tax liability would be can be paid at either point.
So the extra work, I mean, so there's 2 bits of extra work. One is measuring it, taxing it, so I understand that bit. Then there's going to be more extra work in the sense of what you'll be out there looking for more sites.
That's correct. We do, environmental crimes are a priority for SEPA at the moment. We put a lot of time and effort into identifying sites, but what that extra bit of money, what goes back to Eleanor's point, is that we think will pay for itself, is to proactively go out and use our intelligence and use our systems to go out and proactively identify sites that may be liable for landfill tax, and put more effort into that, which we think will pay for itself over time.
Because at the moment there's a lot of sites appearing that you're not seeing or not aware of.
Well, I don't know if there's a lot. We've got intelligence from partners, from the public, from our own systems, but we do still occasionally come across sites. But what this money will allow us to do is to put more into proactively looking for them, rather than just relying on intelligence from other people.
Okay, that's me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Jean, to be followed by Michael.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, I think, John Kenny about we have a policy in Scotland of zero waste, and trying to attract that. How does that, is that something that you take into account when you're planning, the financial costs of running?
The landfill tax supports that zero waste agenda, because it diverts material from landfill sites by making landfill sites more expensive, and has been very successful in achieving that aim. So it's very much hand in hand with the approach, as does the illegal waste sites, because by tackling illegal waste sites, which the new legislation allows us to do, it creates a more level playing field for legitimate business, and encourages the kind of technologies that are required to achieve zero waste.
So, I mean, are we achieving just, historically, we're reducing landfill generally?
Yes.
And do you see that as being kind of on time, as it were, or is there
there's targets, and the targets get harder as we move further towards time, and landfill will keep decreasing over time, and towards the targets of having zero biodegradable waste actually going to landfill in 2020. So that's what we're moving towards.
And do you think that the threat, there's more penalties for people abusing the system, will have an effect?
As a risk that by being more on top of the illegal aspect, or having increased costs, it can drive people it can drive people underground. But I think we need to tackle the illegal operators and to drive towards zero waste. But I think the solution is to have a toolkit such as this legislation gives us to be able to have an effective deterrent against those that don't want to do it properly.
And I think I remember the early days of this discussion that the OBR had their figures very far out, and that's been corrected. But how does that affect just going forward to 2020? The staffing and the IT systems and so on that we're employing now, will they automatically be used for other taxes? Should Scotland be raising more taxes of our own?
It's a question directed to me at Revenue Scotland. The costs at SEPA, we're looking 5 years ahead on the assumption that SEPA will still have to do broadly what they currently do in terms of collecting Scottish landfill tax. Because there will still be licensing and regulating and collecting tax from broadly the same number of sites and continuing to clamp down on illegal waste. Insofar as we're looking at Revenue Scotland, the capacity that we have, yes, I mean, if over time, and I don't think, by 2020, I doubt we'll be at zero take on landfill tax, but if over time we wind up with no landfill tax, we'll cut down our staffing or divert it onto other things.
Thanks, Convener. When we were looking at the LBTT bill, we noted that ROS appeared to be quite well advanced in terms of help and support, and we raised concerns that there might be a requirement for Revenue Scotland to get a helpline in place, and the government pointed out in response to those observations that the three organisations that are here this morning were working together to assess the demand and plan for the provision of a suitable coordinated support to taxpayers via effective helplines. It also said that we would be updated on that, so could you update us on the progress on that?
Surely. We put a brief summary in the written update on the arrangements that we intend to have, and as you'll see from that, we are intending to provide helpline support. That there'll be a single number, and calls will be passed around as they need to be between the organisations to make sure that people are able to get an answer to their question without having to be told to go away and speak to someone else.
Yeah. I suppose my question is how far advanced are you discovering any problems with that, or is that progress being made towards having that in place by the time it's required?
We're well on track, I think, to have that all in place. We don't have the single telephone number yet, obviously, but the arrangements are well developed amongst the organisations, and we expect to have it all in place, in fact, in advance of the 1st of April.
Okay, that's fine.
That's great, Michael. And that appears to have concluded the questions from the committee. So I'll just ask a further question. I realise that Mr King's feeling somewhat neglected this morning, actually. The questions directed to him. So I thought, I can't let him just sit there. You've got to earn your crust this morning, Mr King. So I'm just going to ask you a wee question, and it's based on Ms Emberson's paper. And just to quote, it says here, although Registers of Scotland's role in IT build and maintenance will now reduce, it will be represented on the joint IT implementation project board and team. This will support the development of a one-stop shop for the taxpayer for registration of property transactions and the collection of any associated tax. And I'm just wondering if you can expand on a wee bit for the committee on that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of the IT solution, I mean, I guess going back to our original appearance before the committee, ROS were at that stage looking to develop and build the LBTT collection system, and the new IT solution has moved that on, and doing so that avoids ROS building that and then Revenue Scotland duplicating that. So we're looking in terms of IT solution for a more streamlined build, which our ROS systems will integrate into. From a taxpayer perspective, they should see no difference whatsoever. There'll still be an online facility for submitting a tax return and for any payment of tax. There'll be various ways into that. One of them certainly that's envisaged is through the Registers of Scotland's current e-portal, and that will link up with some of our other activities which the taxpayer or taxpayers' representatives might want to carry out insofar as the related registration of the particular property transaction in question concerns. So it'll still be seamless for the taxpayer. It'll just be more efficient behind the scenes for particularly Revenue Scotland, but also Registers of Scotland as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. And just before we go, I'm just wondering if our witnesses have any further points they wish to make to the committee? No? Okay, well, thank you very much for your attendance, for responding to your questions this morning. Thank you. I'll now call a 5-minute recess for our changeover of witnesses. Okay, folks, we'll start in 30 seconds. We will now continue to take evidence on the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, Employment and Sustainable Growth, who's accompanied by Eleanor Emberson and Colin Miller of the Scottish Government. First of all, I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for coming down early for this session, and can I invite him to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. The Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bills is the third of 3 Scottish tax bills which the committee has considered since November 2012. The first 2 relating to land and buildings transaction tax and Scottish landfill tax are now on the statute book. They are the first pieces of tax legislation which the Scottish Parliament has agreed in more than 300 years. The Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Bill has 3 main purposes. Firstly, it establishes Revenue Scotland as the tax authority which will be responsible for the collection and management of the first 2 devolved taxes. Second, it sets out in one place the statutory framework within which Revenue Scotland will operate. And that includes the Constitution of Revenue Scotland, the relationship between the taxpayer and the tax authority, Revenue Scotland's investigatory and enforcement powers, and a new distinctively Scottish approach to tax avoidance. Third, it provides a clear and robust tax management framework which could readily be adapted in the event of this Parliament taking on more responsibility for taxes. It is therefore very important that we get this bill right. The committee's evidence sessions over the last few months have been an important contribution to achieving that, as have the comments of experts such as Professor Sir James Merlees and John Whiting, and witnesses from the legal and tax professions. The task of preparing this bill was not easy. We benefited from a great deal of input from a wide range of stakeholders whose contribution was much valued. Most of the witnesses who have given evidence have supported the general approach that we have taken, and I am confident that we've got the fundamentals of this bill correct. But in an area as complex as this, there will certainly be scope for improvements at stage 2. I know the committee has received positive suggestions from witnesses for improvements in the bill. We will reflect carefully on these points, and of course I look forward to the committee's Stage 1 report and the recommendations in due course. I'd like to turn briefly, Convener, to the issue of combating tax avoidance, which I know is one of the issues the committee has been looking at very closely. I've been very clear that we intend to take the toughest possible line on tax avoidance, and I mean avoidance, not just the most extreme cases of abuse. With that in mind, the bill provides power in a general anti-avoidance rule for Revenue Scotland to take robust counteraction against artificial tax avoidance schemes. We chose to provide 2 definitions of artificiality to make sure that our approach was as comprehensive as possible. Revenue Scotland will be able to take counteraction where the tax avoidance arrangement is not a reasonable course of action, having regard to the principles and policy objectives on which the relevant tax legislation is based, or where the arrangement lacks commercial substance. And the bill sets out a number of indicators which might suggest that an approach does indeed lack commercial substance. I believe that the approach we have adopted is based on straightforward common sense tests that ordinary taxpayers would endorse. I was pleased to see that Michael Clancy, giving evidence to the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee on behalf of the Law Society of Scotland, commented that the Scottish GAR provisions were, and I quote, much better, less complex and should be more effective than the corresponding anti-abuse rule in the UK Finance Act 2013. Of course, the bill does more than combat tax avoidance. It also provides what we believe is a fair, efficient and transparent approach to the administration of taxes. It seeks to balance the public interest in collecting taxes with the reasonable expectations of individual taxpayers. For example, by making provision for reviews, mediation and appeals in relation to decisions taken by Revenue Scotland. In conclusion, Convener, I know that all members of the committee share the same objective in relation to this bill, to make sure that it provides the best possible framework for the collection and management of the first 2 devolved taxes when they come into force on the 1st of April 2015, and to provide a firm foundation which we can build upon in the event of this Parliament being responsible for a wider range of taxes. And I look forward to discussing these issues with the committee this morning.
Thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary. And I note that you said in your opening statement there, and I quote, that you would impose the toughest possible line on avoidance, and certainly from my perspective I think that's a very positive thing. You also talked about the issue of principles as well. So would you confirm that this the Scottish Government's approach to the GAR is in actual fact a principled one rather than a rules-based one?
It is based on a principles approach, Convener. I think that's perhaps the best way to sum it up. The policy intention is very clear that we are taking all steps through the contents of the bill and the approaches that will be taken by Revenue Scotland to issue proactively a message that tax avoidance is unacceptable, and that the focus and the approach and the operational activities of Revenue Scotland will be to act within the spirit of that principles-based approach on this question. So I think that there are clearly choices to be made in these areas of policy. You can be very specific and prescriptive about what is in and what is out. I think the danger with that is that it just creates the incentive to find ways of just operating at the margins, and the principles-based approach, which is enshrined within the bill, is designed to signal very clearly that that type of practice would be unacceptable.
Because I mean, some of the witnesses talked about the difference between the general anti-abuse rule for the UK and the general anti-avoidance rule in Scotland, and it's quite interesting. I mean, many of the witnesses who favour the issue of certainty didn't point out that south of the border have had to introduce some 300 targeted, anti-abuse rules in order to try and pin down the fact that it's not such a principled approach. I'm just wondering what you would say to organisations such as ICAS, CIOT, etc., who have urged certainty in terms of the legislation rather than the approach that you've taken.
I think there is a clear assurance of certainty in the legislation that we've taken, and the certainty is don't get involved in tax avoidance. Don't know how more certain it needs to be.
Thank you very much for that. One of the things that progressing through the bill that witnesses have suggested to us is that there's a bit of an anomaly in terms of the issue of penalties. Some penalties are actually on the face of the bill and some of them are not, and I'm just wondering why that is the case.
I think this is an area where I mentioned in my opening remarks, Convener, that we've been looking carefully at the evidence that the committee has been hearing, and I think as we've looked at the points that have been expressed on penalties, we've come to the conclusion that the existing provisions are not as clear and as consistent as they could be. So we'll look further at that question in the light of the committee's report, and obviously we'll have an opportunity at the stage 1 debate to reflect on some of our responses on those points before we get into stage 2, where I would imagine I will bring forward amendments at stage 2 to try to put a great deal more consistency into the penalty arrangement between what is in the on the face of the bill and what's in secondary legislation, with a greater emphasis on what will be on the face of the bill in the light of the evidence that the committee has heard.
Okay, just one further point before I open up to members around the members of the committee, and that's really the structure of Revenue Scotland. And I mean, Eleanor Emerson answered a question on that in the previous session, but I'm just wondering what your view is in terms of the structure, because a number of witnesses have talked about the job of the board being able to hold the executives, including the chief executive, to account, and the kind of current structure is that if members of the executive team are members of the board, that can muddy the waters a wee bit in terms of that regard.
I think there are a variety of choices to be made here. Well, I suppose there's probably two choices to be made here, Convener. There's either members of the executive team are on the board or they're not on the board. I don't suppose it's any more complicated than that. I think either model can can work, although what one has to be careful about is that if members of the executive are part of the board, there might be some difficulties created by just proximity, by members of the board feeling they're very much part of the same kind of the same team as the chief executive, and the element of challenge that is required might be eroded, and that's something that's got to. We have public bodies where we have chief executives who are members of the board. We have public bodies where chief executives are not members of the board. In general, I think the arrangements retain that critical element of challenge, which this topic turns on. So I don't think it's a factor that's definitive one way or the other. But certainly we would be wanting to ensure that the arrangements were in place to ensure that the members of the board were able to properly and fully exercise their responsibility to challenge executive recommendation and practice, and to take the appropriate decisions at board level about the operation of Revenue Scotland.
Okay, thank you for that. So the first colleague to ask questions from the committee will be Malcolm, to be followed by Jamie.
I wanted to go on to the garbage, just since you mentioned that last point. Isabel Dinverno, I can't remember which body she is, somebody will look that up for the official report, said there are so many technical issues that Revenue Scotland would have to be involved in relation to the administration and collection of tax policy and so on. That makes a lot more sense for the Chief Executive, who has the greatest knowledge of those things, to be on the board. I mean, could you just clarify in the arrangement which you're proposing, would the Chief Executive still be attending board meetings and able to give that kind of information? Because that seems to be one of the fundamental objections.
Yeah, well, the Chief Executive would have to be at board meetings, but I think the issue turns on whether or not the Chief Executive is a full defined member of the board. Now, I suppose to get this down to its kind of sharpest point, if the Chief Executive is a member of the board, it is difficult for the board to have a conversation that doesn't involve the Chief Executive at its crudest, because the Chief Executive is a member of the board, and it's kind of difficult to say, well, would the Chief Executive leave the room because if they're a member of the board, because they're a member of the board. But in all other circumstances, if we decided for the Chief Executive not to be a member of the board, for example, then the Chief Executive would have to attend the board to provide the specialist advice and information that would be required. I couldn't see how the system could work effectively without that provision. But what that model provides for is the ability for the board to have a discussion that does not involve the Chief Executive and without any degree of discomfort in the process.
You said in your introduction we would have a new distinctively Scottish approach to tax avoidance. So obviously we've had a lot of different views on that, pulled in opposite directions, on the one hand by the Chartered Institute of Taxation and ICAS, and on the other direction by the STUC in particular. So it's really just to try and get, I suppose it would be interesting to get a concrete sense of how it will be different. I thought an interesting example is in relation to the concern of ICAS and the Chartered Institute that the wording should be the main purpose rather than one of the main purposes. And I thought John Whiting gave quite an interesting concrete example of that. I'm sorry, I'm quoting again. I'll try not to quote too much, but he says, I used the example of incorporation. If I advise someone on incorporation, one of the purposes of the advice is to enable them to take into account tax consideration. I would not be doing my job if I did not explain that aspect to them. Giving someone advice on incorporation is therefore immediately within the ambit of the provision, whereas nobody would say that the sole or main purpose of advice on incorporation is tax avoidance. So could there be an implication in terms of what you're proposing that incorporation would automatically be regarded as tax avoidance in Scotland, whereas that is not the case in the UK, because clearly a lot of people use incorporation in order to reduce the amount of tax that they pay?
I don't think that would be a reasonable point to sustain, given the fact that one of there are two essential factors that we put in to specify the approach on the general anti-avoidance rule. One is artificiality, which I don't think is as relevant in the example that that John Whiting has cited. But the other one is commercial substance. And I do think commercial substance and incorporation will be very closely connected as considerations. So to answer Mr Chisholm's point, would the very act of considering incorporation issues fall foul of this legislation? I don't think it would, because that would be about the commercial substance of the advice that was being offered by the advisor to the organisation. So what we've tried to do with the provisions, and I've listened very carefully to the debates that Parliament has led on this subject, and you know, different elements of the debate which come up in our consideration of the two previous bills and other question opportunities within Parliament, and the general temperature of the debate within Scotland. And I've tried to take what I would describe as a maximalist position on tackling tax avoidance, and we've translated that into the substance of the two tests of artificiality and commercial substance to try to define the scope of how advisors should act in this in this area.
And we had quite a lot of interesting comments about the double reasonableness test in the UK, but we won't go there. But I suppose a concrete manifestation of that, perhaps in the UK, is the recent creation of an advisory panel to give some, I don't know whether quasi-objectivity perhaps is the phrase, you know, some external view rather than just the review of the revenue. I mean, has there been any consideration to setting up such a panel in Scotland? I think a lot of this comes back to the point the convener raised with me at the very outset about where do the principles lie here. Unless I have misinterpreted where Parliament is on these questions, I think Parliament is in a maximalist position on tackling tax avoidance. That's how it certainly feels to me in answering questions from members of Parliament on this subject. I think when you go into solutions like an independent review panel, it feels to me a bit like we're trying to devise a mechanism to undermine the principle that we're all trying to tackle and we're trying to take forward, which is to attack tax avoidance. Because we almost are trying to approve of, condone, find a way of accepting tax avoidance initiatives. And if we're going to be principled about it, why would bother to do that? Why are we not just saying to people, look, this is how we do it here. Just pay your taxes. And you know, let's not go through all sorts of elaborate activities to try to find ways of not doing so. You're probably right. A lot of people would come from that kind of position, but I mean, it would still be right. Just moving on to the last topic.
I think so. I should perhaps if you'd forgive me, I should also probably say there are, of course, other steps that a taxpayer could take to challenge the decisions of Revenue Scotland. It's not just that, you know, if Revenue Scotland takes a decision and a taxpayer doesn't like it, there are mechanisms of challenge which they can then pursue, which give a statutory force to the right of individuals to say that they think the wrong conclusion has been reached.
Well, that was really what my last question was going to be about. I mean, I think some points were raised about the appeal system, and a couple of them were, as I understand it, there's going to be some restriction of the right of appeal, although I'm not entirely clear about the details of that, but that was certainly a point made by the, I think, the Faculty of Advocates, possibly the Law Society as well. And another point relating to appeals was, this was from the Law Society, there was concern that the upper tribunal could have a single member judging the appeal at its second hearing, which is different from the current arrangement. So the general impression we got from those two legal bodies was that there was some significant changes to the appeal system. So given that you are moving to a more vigorous approach to tax avoidance, I suppose it could be argued that it's even more important to have a transparently fair appeal system.
Well, on that question, I'd be open to considering whether or not the arrangements we have in place pass that test, because I think the test that Mr Chisholm has just raised is absolutely a fair test. The basis of appeal would have to be on a point of law, which I don't think is a particularly new method of accessing the appeal system. It's certainly, you know, absolutely commonplace in the mainstream court arrangements. On the second point that Mr Chisholm raised about whether or not the tribunal had sufficient breadth of overview, whether more members were required, I'm certainly, that's a point of detail which I'm very happy to consider in the light of the evidence the committee has heard, and whatever the committee judges on that point I'll look at carefully. But the principle that Mr Chisholm is making, that if we're not having a sort of independent body to essentially second-guess Revenue Scotland, and we're doing it through the formal system, then I accept unreservedly that that appeal mechanism must be fair and must be seen to be fair in the interests of taxpayers as well as Revenue Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Jamie, to be followed by John.
Following on from your own question and Mr Chisholm's question on the structure of Revenue Scotland and whether or not the executives are on the board, I hope it will be helpful for us to bear in mind that it was only a few witnesses that actually have raised this. And as you know, most have not particularly taken view, and they're pretty relaxed about what is proposed. So, I mean, I hope certainly we as a committee will bear that in mind. Presumably the government will too. But the questions, the areas of question I want to ask are pretty straightforward. One's Mr Miller, when he was here previously, gave an undertaking to look again at a couple of issues, and I'm just wondering if we can get a sort of update on that. One was the Bill team going to look at whether or not it could be possible to more tightly define the level of privilege provided to the legal profession, and also I think there was an acceptance that the drafting in relation to Revenue Scotland's charter wasn't particularly brilliant, so I'm just wondering if we can get an update on that.
On the question of professional privilege, I think the issue tends to be, I think legal advisors generally think that their professional privilege is being properly protected in the legislation. I think it's the tax advisors in the accountancy and advisory sector who are perhaps slightly less comfortable. This is not an easy issue, because I think the definition of a tax advisor, we could have, we might have difficulty defining precisely who would be acceptable to give tax advice. In the unlikely event of me offering Mr Hepburn tax advice, I suppose I could be loosely described as a tax advisor, but I'm sure he'd think twice about it.
Straightforward.
I'm sure in the complex financial arrangements that Mr Hepburn has, he would need my advice. But and that, in a sense, highlights some of the kind of difficulties of terminology in providing a comparable arrangement between the legal profession and the tax and accountancy profession. So I think there's a likelihood that we would probably, if we were extending that to the definition of a tax advisor, we probably would be including individuals who have no professional qualifications and don't belong to a professional body, although there will be some tax advisors who have professional qualifications and belong to a professional body. So we'll look as to whether or not there is a way of making progress on that question. I fear it might be administratively quite demanding to do so. But we will look at it. But I think where we've got, what we've tried to do is to strike a fair balance by recognising legal professional privilege, which is a very well-established principle, but I think it would go too far to extend privilege to anyone who presents himself as a tax advisor. But we will look further at it before, and obviously listen carefully to what the committee says in this respect. On the question of the Charter, there appear to have been a couple of issues. The first was whether there should be a requirement on Revenue Scotland to consult externally on preparing or updating the Charter of Standards and Values. I think we probably should put a duty on Revenue Scotland to do that, so we'll bring forward amendments at stage 2 to substantiate that. And then the second is that the bill is a bit out of balance in that it says that we say that Revenue Scotland will aspire to live up to the Charter, and we expect people to aspire to the Charter, and that is an uneven playing field. So we'll rectify that at stage 2.
That's helpful, and I think that will be welcomed across the board. Just going back to the issue of privilege, I mean, I actually accept, and I have a particular view on it at the start, but I totally accept the point that, I mean, I think the issue was more about whether or not it would be possible to tightly define the circumstances in which privilege extends to the legal profession, because my understanding is it's not a blanket provision, and I think Mr Miller had suggested that's something that could be looked at. I don't know if that is something that's
well, we will undertake further exploration of this issue to satisfy ourselves that we've got the balance right. But the dangers and difficulties that I highlighted in my earlier answer are very real considerations that we have to reflect upon.
Malcolm Chisholm raised the issue of appeals, and that brings me on to an issue that was raised by the Faculty of Advocates, which kind of seemed sort of trivial at first. They suggested that the tribunals that are set up should have distinctive names so that they won't be confused with UK ones, and actually Philip Simpson actually gave useful evidence to say that it isn't a trivial matter, because you know, litigants could be confused, and the type of litigant that could be involved could be quite a small amount of tax for the taxation authority, but to them it could be quite a lot. It could be a sort of more low-income taxpayers. So, you know, is this something that was evidence that was given the 12th of March, just to help our colleagues out in the official report? You know, is that is something that can be looked at?
Certainly, we'll look very carefully at that point, and it's our objective to avoid any circumstance where there is confusion about the relevant body. So we'll make sure that terminology is absolutely precise, and if there is a necessity to make any stage 2 amendments, we'll do so.
The fact that I had helpfully given suggestions, but I can't remember what they are just now. And one other, again, it seemed sort of trivial, and it was the Faculty of Advocates. But in the bill itself, they said where there's references to other acts of Parliament, it's just given by year, and they were making the point that, you know, if we have a greater competence, if there's other tax acts in future, this could become quite confusing, and should they be referred to sort of differently with an acronym as well? Again, it seems sort of a trivial point, but in terms of interpreting and looking at legislation going forward, it could be more important than it seems at first glance.
Again, we'd be happy to look at the operational impact of such a provision.
Thank you. Deputy Convener.
Thanks, Convener. Well, seeing Mr Hepburn was going on about professions, let's go there again. I should declare that I'm a member of ICAS. I see from the Herald this week that there are 14 MSPs with a legal profession, and I think I may be the only one with an accountancy background, so I'm in a minority here. But, I mean, your first point that it would be difficult to pin down what were tax advisors. I mean, we do have a variety of professions. We've got the Law Society, who largely regulate lawyers, solicitors, and we have ICAS, Chartered Institute of Taxation, and these other groups which regulate their members. So, I mean, to create an even playing field, you know, would it be possible to actually specify the institutes? I mean, I think one of the concerns was we had some evidence that, you know, lawyers are not using this so far in Scotland to to market themselves, but in London there is some evidence that lawyers are actually going out to the public and saying, come to us and you get more confidentiality than if you go to an accountant or some other advisor.
I think that as I said, I will reflect on this point, and it may be that we can design an approach which properly reflects and addresses the issue that I'm concerned about being absolutely clear of the quality and the nature of the advice that is being offered to individuals from, let us say, an accountancy and tax practitioner. I think we can be very clear about that in the legal profession, because the members that are covered by professional privilege are regulated by the Law Society of Scotland. It is pretty clearly defined in that respect. I'll look to see if it is possible for us to arrive at a comparable definition within the tax and accountancy sector. But I do, I think we do have to be mindful of the fact that there would certainly have to be a very disciplined test of regulation which would enable us to come to a conclusion on that particular point.
Yes. I mean, having made that point, I mean, I would also echo what I think Mr. Hepburn was saying, that actually my preference would be, and I think there's other members in the committee probably who would, it would be not, rather than extending it, it would be actually restricting it. And if we could say, and if that might be the easier answer, is if the legal profession's privilege is restricted very tightly to legal matters which other advisors would not be getting involved in, then I personally would find that quite acceptable. And then if it's in the tax realm, really, if it's clearly in the tax realm, then there wouldn't be privilege for anybody. So that's the other option.
If the committee would care to reflect on these issues, obviously, as I've indicated already, and as I have undertaken in the two previous bills, I'll await the outcome of the committee's deliberations before forming a view as to what steps the government needs to take to address these points.
That's great. Thanks very much. I mean, we've touched already on anti-avoidance and certainty and some of these kind of issues, and we had quite a lot of arguments put to us. I mean, a lot of people asking for certainty, and you've already commented on that, that that can just give people a way around a kind of loophole. I mean, I don't know if you'd agree. My feeling is that certainty is good for good taxpayers, but it's not good for bad taxpayers, i.e. people who are trying to avoid their tax. And I just wonder how we get the balance in there, because we do need to get a fair degree of certainty so that people don't innocently get kind of trapped by all of this.
I think the message I'm trying to convey to the committee today, and the message I've tried to convey around this bill throughout, is that I'm seeing this as, yes, a set of legislative provisions that we have to get correct and precise to take forward, but it's also about signalling a change of culture. There is a culture which almost says, well, it doesn't almost say, it says that, it's quite all right to deploy an endless amount of creativity to find a way of avoiding paying tax. It's no secret that the minute the Chancellor of the Exchequer sits down in the House of Commons, various people are running away as quickly as possible to find a way of undermining what the Chancellor of the Exchequer has just announced. If he's decided to tighten some tax provision, it's a kind of it's just in common currency. And I'm signalling here that we, as we embark on this, at the start of the first exercise of tax management and collection responsibilities in Scotland in 300 years, that we're starting off on the right footing. And the right footing is that we expect people to pay their taxes and not to be investing heavily and trying to find ways of avoiding that. And to enable us to do that, we're then turning that cultural aspiration into legislative form with the general anti-avoidance rule, and to make that as high a bar as we possibly can do. And when I've been thinking about the formulation of these provisions in the bill with my officials and with the Tax Consultation Forum, that's what's been in my thinking, and I've been taking that into those discussions very firmly from what I feel Parliament, and my judgment of where I think Parliament is on these questions, because I'm certainly getting regularly questioned in Parliament about ensuring that organisations and individuals properly pay the taxes that they are due. So we signal in this legislation a difference of culture, and we reinforce that with the measures on the general anti-avoidance rule. And I don't actually think there is much cause for concern amongst good, faithful taxpayers that somehow they will inadvertently find themselves in a difficult position, because good, faithful taxpayers will be paying their taxes anyway. And for people who are maybe looking to say, well, how can we creatively avoid paying what is due to be paid, the signal is, well, that's not the way we're doing things here.
I mean, one of the professional advisors said most taxpayers want to pay the correct amount of tax. Now, I have to confess I was not completely convinced by that. I was slightly more sceptical. Do you have a view on that?
I think I don't. You know, the Church of Scotland report that came out a few weeks ago, which was a product of the Imagining Scotland's Future exercise that went on within the Church of Scotland. They had this line of argument about the joy of paying tax. And, you know, with no disrespect to the Church of Scotland, I thought that was slightly on the optimistic side. But, you know, I know the point they're making. The point they're making is that we should actually, you know, confidently and comfortably pay tax because it's for a good purpose, because it's, you know, assisting with the wider policy objectives that are broadly supported by our civic community. But I'm not sure people really enjoy it or take a sense of joy out of doing it. So I think if there is a way that people can think, can I minimise my tax obligation, will they take it, then I think that's you know, I think I'd probably share your scepticism, Mr. Mason, on these questions. So therefore, I think what we should just do is set out a very clear agenda as to how these issues will be taken forward.
I mean, one of the arguments you put forward, which I have to say I agree with, is that we should move to a more principles-based approach rather than the letter of the law, and that's a slight move away from Westminster. Now, we have had some evidence that other countries are even more radical in some aspects, and, for example, publish all their tax returns for everybody, and in some cases even give prizes and awards and incentives to the top 10 taxpayers in the country. I mean, we seem to be staying quite close to the tradition of confidentiality and privacy. Could you give us a comment on that?
I think the issue I would think about that is that, you know, if we were, for example, to go to the open publication of tax information, I think it wouldn't give on the tax responsibilities we currently have, it wouldn't give a particularly informative picture of what that's all about. I'm also not sure that the publication arrangements are necessary, or if they actually inform the debate sufficiently to enable the best practice in tax paying to emerge. You know, I think what I've set out to the committee this morning and what's in the bill is designed to create the best practice of tax paying within Scotland, and I'm pretty confident that that approach, that structure is able to will be able to create that good practice within the tax paying population.
Okay. Going back to the kind of avoidance and so on, Mr. Chisholm mentioned that he was not going to discuss the reasonable test, but I quite like it, so let's have a wee go at that. And Mr. Whiting was one of the people that gave evidence on that, because one of the contrasts that was made by some of the professional groups was that we only use the word reasonable once, and in the UK legislation there is this double reasonableness test, although it struck me that you could actually put reasonable 3 times in the one sentence, and Mr Whiting suggested you could put it 4 times in the one sentence. I mean, I suppose it's a question of degree. Did you have a particular reason why we would just use the word reasonable once as compared to the UK legislation twice?
I think that is the use of reasonable once is consistent with the style and the standard of the legislation that we're putting forward, which is to signal that the degree of flexibility and interpretation that surrounds the payment of taxes will be kept at a minimal level within the tax system in Scotland. So therefore, you know, the more times you use the word reasonable, you inevitably dilute the principle. The first time you use it, you dilute it further the second time, you dilute it even more the third time, and if you use it a fourth time, well, I suspect you've nothing left to dilute.
That's helpful. And the final area I wanted to touch on was earlier this morning we took a little bit of evidence on the financial memorandum and the point that on the basic costs, which I accept were some time ago, HMRC's quote was somewhat higher than Revenue Scotland's. Now, since then, things have developed and we're doing what I understand to be extra work, which Ms Emerson already reported on, and so there is that extra cost of, I think, £3.5 million. I mean, is it your view that HMRC would not have done any of that work if they had been doing the overall package? And, I mean, do you think their costs for doing that extra work would have been higher or lower or whatever?
I think it's important to remember the basis of the original cost estimates that we published. They were on a like-for-like basis of HMRC actually continuing essentially with the current provisions on landfill tax and stamp duty land tax. So they weren't, we didn't ask for a quote on what it would be to deviate from the stamp duty land tax proposals that essentially were the status quo from the United Kingdom provisions onto the progressive land and buildings transaction tax. Now, I think if we'd asked for that quote, the HMRC number would have been higher because it would have involved significantly more system redesign and change to accommodate that. So the cost estimates to begin with were on the basis of us undertaking the reforms that we wish to take forward and the HMRC provision of the status quo. Now, in relation to the other costs that have been identified, some of them are for entirely new areas of activity, which essentially are, I think, a product of the discussions that we've had about our own aspirations in the bill. You know, we want, for example, to tackle the illegal depositing of waste, and that's not something that's tackled today. So clearly, I have to accept that there's a new cost arises out of that, which has emerged out of our handling of the legislation. So I think we are monitoring the cost issues very, very closely to ensure that those core costs are fulfilled, core costs that have been explained to Parliament are fulfilled, and that we properly account for any additional functions that we take on and financially control all of those elements into the bargain.
So if we had used HMRC, the costs would probably have been at least the same or potentially even higher?
Well, the original HMRC cost was higher than the cost estimated by undertaking the system that we're implementing under Revenue Scotland. If we then asked HMRC to do additional functions, then we would have had to pay for them. So there would have been further additional costs beyond the £22.3 million of costs that were estimated by HMRC.
One of the extra costs is the tribunals being introduced, and presumably that means there's a saving to somebody for the present tribunal system that is not being used anymore by Scotland. I'm just wondering, would that be something that might be affected when we get the block grant adjustment, that if there's a saving to the UK system, that would feed through?
Well, we'll have a shot at that, but we'll see how we get on. But I suspect the de minimis, the level of cost difference by Scottish cases coming out of the UK tribunal system will be very close to de minimis, I would think, given the volume of caseload that's involved there.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, John. Next person to ask questions will be Gavin. I just want to apologise to Gavin. Actually, I think I implied that the session would start later than it did, which is why you missed the first 2 or 3 minutes of your opening statement. Gavin.
Cabinet Secretary, I was encouraged by your comments on penalties, I have to say, with which I agree. Just for clarity, were you saying that you're definitely going to lodge Stage 2 amendments, or that you will review the evidence in our report and you may lodge amendments at Stage 2?
I definitely will lodge some amendments. I think the question will be, when I look at the committee's report, how extensive those amendments will be, but there certainly will be some to change the balance between the emphasis on penalties in primary and secondary legislation.
So I'm encouraged by that. It makes half of my questions redundant, which
I'll
put to one side.
Well, I'm glad to have obliged.
The next question, we've obviously had some discussion on whether or not the Chief Executive should be a member of Revenue Scotland. Just on that, in terms of Schedule 1, the legislation says that there will be between 5 and 9 members of Revenue Scotland. Does the government have a view at this stage on how many members there will be for the initial set-up of Revenue Scotland?
I think it's my view would be it's likely to be at the lower end of the spectrum, but I obviously have to be mindful about the longevity of board members to enable there to be proper retention of corporate expertise over a passage of time. So it may edge up beyond that to then give us members from which we can generate turnover and new faces to come in and to build the corporate knowledge of the organisation.
Section 8 of the bill is described as ministerial guidance, and this is where guidance is given from ministers to Revenue Scotland, and in the main that guidance will be published. But there is a get-out clause, if you like, where it doesn't always have to be published. Now, some people giving evidence have suggested that there should be a blanket rule that it's always published. As it stands, obviously, it doesn't have to be published, although I suspect the intention is that it broadly will be published. Are you able to expand on that? Are there examples where you think it shouldn't be published, or is the government listening to evidence there and considering whether all guidance should be published?
My presumption is that I would place greater emphasis on this question on subsection 3, which is that ministers must publish any guidance given to Revenue Scotland under this section as they consider appropriate. That would be where I would vest more of my emphasis in this section. Subsection 4 is required, I think, to give us some necessary, because of the fact that we are involved in an area of activity which involves penalties, which involves the exercise of quite significant decision making about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable, that I think we have to reserve the right for some private space in terms of the guidance from ministers, particularly in relation to operational matters and specifically in relation to avoidance measures. But I would want to assure the committee that my approach would be more heavily vested in section 8.3.
The last issue I wanted to just ask about, I mean, there's obviously been a good amount of discussion this morning on the GAR. You've given your view on the panel of independent experts. Another area that has been raised by a number of witnesses, though, in terms of, given that the GAR is wider than elsewhere, a number of witnesses have suggested the idea of a pre-clearance procedure, either a formal binding procedure or an informal, informative pre-clearance procedure with Revenue Scotland. Does the government have any views on that at this stage?
I'm not sympathetic to a pre-clearance arrangement for many of the reasons that similar ground that I discussed in the answers to Mr Mason. That I think that runs the risk of undermining the cultural approach to the implementation of this legislation, which I am anxious to take forward as a consequence of the acquisition of these powers and responsibilities. So I would see that as being a factor that would potentially undermine the approach to that legislation.
One of the witnesses was representing taxpayer, or speaking on behalf, I guess, of taxpayers who were perhaps on low salaries and didn't have accountants or lawyers or tax advisors primarily, and so they suggested a number of things, including the two things I've suggested. How would you ensure that unrepresented taxpayers, if I describe them as that, wouldn't fall into the GAR inadvertently?
I struggle to find where that would be a cause of great concern that could not be addressed by the support that the government more widely makes available to advisory services and financial advisory services within our communities. I think that the ground that is likely to be relevant in those areas is likely to be available in the wider financial advice community that's available through a range of different organisations that the government and our local authority partners support.
Okay, maybe leave just with a comment, if I may, Convener. I mean, it's clearly guidance would be read and understood by advisors and professional tax professionals, as it were. I just was quite struck by the evidence given by that particular witness, and your. Well, I just wonder if it's something that the government might reflect upon.
Well, to make sure that I will look specifically at that point in the light of the because again, it's the purpose of the legislation is not to entrap individuals in that situation. So I will look specifically at that evidence and see if the committee wishes to express a view on that. I'll obviously consider that carefully as well.
Grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. That's concluded the questions from the committee. So I'm just going to take you to part 5 of the policy memorandum, paragraph 62, which says, and I quote, the UK government operates a disclosure of tax avoidance schemes regime, which applies to SDLT, although not to LFT. The Scottish Government doesn't think that a DOTIS arrangement is necessary in relation to SLFT due to the nature of the tax. Tax evasion is the main issue rather than tax avoidance. Further consideration has been given to a DOTIS-type regime in relation to LBTT. Work is continuing to explore this further. It may be decided to bring forward such a scheme by way of amendments to the bill at stage 2. So I'm just wondering where your thinking is on this at this time.
It's a finely balanced judgment, Convener, because for many of the reasons that I explained to Mr Brown a second ago, it all fits into the kind of general line of argument that I'm putting forward, that I don't want to put in place mechanisms that undermine what's on the face of the bill, and I think that can be that is often the downfall of tax legislation. So where there's a very specific issue in land and buildings transaction tax that we have considered the issue of a prior clearance approach, quite simply because of the complexity of the issues that are involved, and also to respond to some of the aspiration to have more flexibility in that particular area of policy, balanced against my desire not to open the floodgates. And it's an issue that we're looking at very carefully to determine how we can exercise that balance.
So you haven't decided whether any amendments will come forward at stage 2?
Not at this stage, no.
Okay, that was clarification I was seeking. Any further points you wish to make to committee before we end up the session?
Grateful for the opportunity to discuss the the bill, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for responding to our questions, and thank you, colleagues, for the questions. At the start of the meeting, the committee agreed to take the next item in private. I therefore now close the public part of the meetings. So we'll just have a short recess to allow the public and official report to leave.